If certain people trigger you far more than they should, this is not random. It is not weakness. And it is not a failure of emotional control. According to Carl Jung, intense emotional reactions are often signals, not problems. They are indicators that something unconscious has been activated, and the stronger the reaction, the closer that unconscious material is to the surface. Most people misunderstand what a trigger actually is. They assume it means they are overreacting. They tell themselves they should be calmer, more tolerant, more rational. But this usually makes the reaction worse, because suppression does not dissolve unconscious material. It pushes it further underground. A trigger is not simply an emotional response. It is an emotional disproportion. It is the moment when a situation carries more emotional weight than the situation itself warrants. The emotion lingers. It loops. It returns later. And often, it feels personal, even when it isn't. Jung called this process projection. Projection is not a mistake. It is a natural function of the psyche. When something in us is unconscious, it cannot be experienced directly. So the psyche experiences it indirectly by seeing it in someone else. This is why projection feels so convincing. It feels like the problem is out there, in the other person, in their behavior, in their attitude. But the intensity of the reaction tells a different story. Projection does not mean the other person is innocent. It does not mean your values are wrong. It does not mean there is no real issue. It means your reaction is amplified because it touches something unresolved inside you. This is an important distinction. You can disagree without projection. You can be hurt without projection. Projection appears when the emotional charge feels excessive, when it stays with you, when it keeps returning in different forms, when different people provoke the same reaction. That repetition is the clue. Jung believed projection was one of the safest ways the unconscious reveals itself, because it keeps the material at a distance. You are not flooded with inner imagery. You are not overwhelmed by introspection. You are simply reacting, and then noticing that reaction. This makes projection an ideal entry point for shadow integration, especially for people who become anxious or destabilized by deep inward focus. Instead of digging inside yourself aggressively, you observe what happens naturally in relationships. This is why certain people seem to get under your skin. They activate something you are not yet conscious of, and the psyche uses them as a mirror. Most people resist this idea at first because it feels like blame. But projection is not about blame. It is about responsibility. Responsibility does not mean fault. It means ownership of your internal response. When you say, "This reaction is mine to understand," you reclaim agency. When you say, "This reaction proves they are the problem," you lose it. Projection is often strongest in moral reactions: outrage, contempt, disgust. Moral certainty feels good. It creates a sense of clarity, but it can also hide unconscious material. Jung warned that moral superiority is one of the shadow's favorite disguises, because it allows aggression to express itself while appearing righteous. This does not mean standards disappear. It means reactions are examined rather than indulged. Another common projection appears in envy. Envy is rarely about wanting what someone else has. It is about unlived potential. The psyche reacts painfully when it sees a possibility it has denied. Instead of acknowledging that pain, the ego often attacks the person who triggered it, calling them arrogant, undeserving, lucky, anything except confronting the underlying longing. Idealization is another form of projection. When someone seems unusually impressive, compelling, special, often they are carrying qualities you have not yet claimed in yourself. Projection works in both directions, positive and negative. The psyche uses others to show you what you are disowning. This is why projection is not something to eliminate. It is something to work with, safely, slowly, without collapsing into shame. The goal is not to judge yourself. It is to increase awareness. Awareness creates distance. Distance creates choice. Choice is the real goal of integration. When projection is unconscious, it controls you. When it becomes conscious, it informs you. This is why the first step is not interpretation. It is observation. You notice the reaction. You do not justify it. You do not suppress it. You do not act it out. You simply notice it, and you ask one question: what quality is being activated here? Not, why am I like this? Not, what does this say about me? Not, what is wrong with me? Just, what quality? This keeps the ego intact. It prevents over-identification. It prevents collapse into self-attack. And it keeps the process stabilizing rather than destabilizing. One of the most important things to understand about triggers is that they are rarely subtle. If a reaction is mild, fleeting, and proportionate, it usually does not involve projection. Projection announces itself through intensity. The reaction feels bigger than the moment. It lingers after the interaction ends. It replays in your mind. It resurfaces later, often when nothing new has happened. And this is where many people get confused. They assume the strength of the reaction proves the seriousness of the situation, but Jung argued the opposite. The stronger the emotional charge, the more likely unconscious material is involved. This does not mean the external situation is meaningless. It means the inner reaction is carrying extra weight. To recognize projection safely, you need to become familiar with common trigger patterns, not to diagnose yourself, not to label yourself, but to notice repetition. One of the most common patterns is moral outrage. Someone behaves in a way you find unacceptable. Your reaction is immediate and intense. You feel disgust, anger, certainty. You replay what they did. You imagine confronting them. You feel compelled to talk about it. Moral outrage feels clean. It feels justified. But Jung warned that moral certainty is one of the shadow's most effective disguises, because it allows aggression to express itself while appearing virtuous. This does not mean your values are wrong. It means the emotional charge deserves examination. Often, moral outrage hides disowned aggression, anger that was never allowed to exist directly. Instead of being felt inwardly, it is projected outward. Another common trigger is chronic irritation. Someone consistently annoys you. Nothing they do is extreme, but everything they do bothers you. Their tone, their habits, their presence. This kind of irritation often points to unacknowledged anger or resentment, especially resentment connected to boundaries. Something in you feels imposed upon, overlooked, or taken for granted. But instead of recognizing that anger, the psyche focuses on the other person. Irritation becomes safer than confrontation. Another powerful trigger is envy. Envy is deeply misunderstood. Most people believe envy means wanting what someone else has. But psychologically, envy often signals unlived potential. You see someone embodying a trait, a freedom, or a capacity you have denied in yourself. Confidence, creativity, independence, expression. The pain does not come from them having it. It comes from you not allowing yourself to develop it. Because that pain is difficult to face, the ego attacks the external figure. They are arrogant, lucky, full of themselves. Envy transforms into contempt. Idealization is the mirror image of envy. Someone seems unusually impressive, magnetic, special. You place them on a pedestal. You feel smaller in their presence. Often, they are carrying qualities you have not yet claimed in yourself: strength, authority, wisdom, creativity. The psyche projects these qualities outward because it does not yet trust itself to hold them. Idealization can be just as destabilizing as hostility, because it places power outside yourself. Another common trigger is disproportionate shame. Someone makes a small comment, offers mild feedback, or expresses disappointment. Your reaction is immediate collapse. You feel exposed, defective, ashamed. This often indicates a shadow around worth and adequacy, parts of you that were criticized or rejected early in life. Instead of seeing the feedback as information, the psyche reacts as if survival is at stake. Projection does not only involve anger, it also involves fear. Fear of rejection, fear of exposure, fear of inadequacy. Fear can be projected onto others as judgment. You assume they are critical, hostile, disapproving. Even when there is little evidence, this creates constant tension in relationships. Jung believed that projection persists until it is recognized. Life will bring the same theme back repeatedly. Different people, different situations, same emotional reaction, until awareness arrives. The purpose of this repetition is not punishment, it is integration. The psyche is trying to make something conscious. Once you recognize a recurring trigger pattern, the work is not to fix it immediately. The work is to stay with it. Calmly, curiously, without judgment. This is where most people rush. They want meaning immediately. They want to know what it says about them. But interpretation too early destabilizes the process. First comes observation. You notice the trigger. You notice the emotion. You notice the bodily response. You do not suppress it. You do not act it out. You do not justify it. You simply allow it to be present, and you remind yourself of one stabilizing truth. The feeling is real, but it is not the whole picture. This distinction is crucial. You can feel anger without becoming aggression. You can feel envy without becoming resentful. You can feel shame without collapsing. Awareness creates space. Space creates choice. As projection becomes conscious, its intensity begins to reduce, not instantly, but gradually. You recover faster. You ruminate less. You are less consumed. The reaction loses its grip. This is how integration begins in real life, not through dramatic insight, but through reduced compulsion. When projection remains unconscious, it controls behavior. When it becomes conscious, it informs behavior. That is the shift, and this is why shadow work done through projection is safer than aggressive introspection. You remain oriented to life, to relationships, to responsibility, instead of disappearing into your own mind. In the next part, we will look at what happens after projection is recognized, how triggers begin to change, why emotional reactions soften, and how integration leads not to numbness, but to greater emotional range and stability. Once projection is recognized, something subtle but important begins to change. The trigger does not disappear overnight. The emotion still arises, but it no longer feels as overwhelming. It no longer takes over your entire inner landscape. This is because recognition restores distance, and distance restores choice. When a trigger is unconscious, it feels compulsory. You react before you know what is happening. You replay conversations. You rehearse arguments. You feel pulled toward justification or withdrawal. But when projection becomes conscious, a pause appears. You still feel the emotion, but you are no longer fused with it. This is one of the clearest signs that integration has begun. The goal is not to eliminate triggers. The goal is to stop being possessed by them. Many people fear that if they stop reacting intensely, they will become passive, detached, indifferent. But Jung did not believe integration reduced emotional life. He believed it expanded it. Integration does not flatten emotion. It gives it proportion. You still feel anger, but it fits the situation. You still feel sadness, but it moves through you. You still feel fear, but it no longer dictates your behavior. This is what emotional maturity looks like, not numbness, but regulation. As projection integrates, another important change occurs. Your attention shifts inward, but not in a destabilizing way. Instead of obsessing over the other person, you begin to notice yourself, not with judgment, but with curiosity. You start to recognize familiar inner themes, patterns of anger, patterns of shame, patterns of longing, patterns of fear. And because these patterns are now seen, they begin to loosen. This is why Jung emphasized that consciousness itself has a regulating effect. What remains unconscious behaves autonomously. What becomes conscious enters relationship, and relationship changes behavior. This is especially important when it comes to anger. Many triggers involve suppressed anger. Anger that was never allowed to be expressed directly. Anger that was judged, feared, or punished early in life. Instead of being acknowledged, it was redirected into irritation, into resentment, into anxiety, into moral outrage. As projection integrates, anger becomes clearer, not louder, clearer. You begin to recognize when a boundary has been crossed, when a need has been ignored, when something important to you has been compromised. And instead of reacting impulsively, you can respond deliberately. This is where boundaries form naturally, not as scripts, not as techniques, but as expressions of clarity. You no longer need to over-explain. You no longer need to apologize excessively. You no longer need to justify your limits. You simply know where you stand. This often feels unfamiliar, especially to people who learned early on that asserting themselves was unsafe. But as the shadow integrates, self-abandonment becomes harder to maintain, not because you become selfish, but because you become honest. Another important shift occurs around shame. Many triggers are rooted in shame, the fear of being exposed, the fear of being inadequate, the fear of being unworthy. When projection is unconscious, shame collapses the self. A small interaction can feel catastrophic. A mild criticism can feel like total rejection. As awareness grows, shame loses its absolute power. You can feel discomfort without collapsing. You can tolerate imperfection without self-attack. You begin to see that the reaction belongs to an old pattern, not the present moment. This is deeply stabilizing, because it restores a sense of continuity. You are no longer constantly redefining yourself based on emotional reactions. You remain yourself through them. Jung believed this continuity was essential for psychological health. Without it, the personality fragments. With it, the psyche becomes resilient. This is why integration does not make life easier. It makes it steadier. As projection softens, relationships change. You are less reactive, less defensive, less inclined to assume hostile intent. This does not mean you tolerate harmful behavior. It means you respond to it with clarity instead of compulsion. You can address issues directly. You can disengage when needed. You can choose distance without resentment. This is an important distinction. Integration does not make you agreeable. It makes you grounded. Another sign of integration is reduced rumination. When projection is active, the mind loops. It replays. It argues. It rehearses. This looping is not thinking. It is unresolved emotion seeking discharge. As awareness increases, rumination decreases. Not because you force it to stop, but because the underlying pressure has been relieved. The psyche no longer needs to repeat the signal. This frees mental energy, energy that can be directed toward creativity, toward work, toward relationships, toward presence. This is one of the hidden benefits of integration. Life feels less crowded internally, not empty, but spacious. This spaciousness can feel strange at first, especially if inner noise has been constant. But over time, it becomes a source of stability. You trust yourself more, not because you have all the answers, but because you can tolerate not having them. This tolerance is a sign of strength. In the next and final part, we will look at what makes this process sustainable over time, why integration cannot be rushed, why patience is not passivity, and why, paradoxically, the more integrated the shadow becomes, the less central it feels in your life. There is one final piece that determines whether this work leads to stability or slowly turns into another form of obsession: time. The unconscious does not move on schedules. It does not respond to urgency. It does not integrate material simply because you want relief. It unfolds when the psyche is ready. This is difficult to accept in a culture that values speed and efficiency. Many people come to inner work wanting fast clarity. They want answers. They want certainty. They want resolution. But psychological growth is not linear. It is rhythmic. It advances, pauses, revisits, and deepens. When people try to force this rhythm, the psyche resists. This is why impatience quietly undermines shadow work. People chase insight as a way to escape discomfort. They believe that if they can just understand enough, the feeling will go away. But understanding alone is not integration. Integration requires capacity, and capacity develops slowly. Jung warned about becoming too conscious. By this, he did not mean awareness itself was dangerous. He meant awareness without sufficient grounding. When insight outpaces the personality's ability to live it, instability follows. People know too much and can hold too little. They become hyper-aware but not resilient. They see everything but cannot rest. This is why integration is inseparable from ordinary life. If inner work does not translate into calmer responses, clearer boundaries, and reduced compulsion, then it is not integration. It is rumination. True integration simplifies life. It does not complicate it. Another misconception is that integration removes discomfort. It does not. It changes your relationship to it. You stop interpreting discomfort as failure. You stop assuming that tension means something is wrong. You recognize discomfort as information. And information does not need to be feared. As this relationship changes, something unexpected often happens. Life becomes quieter, less dramatic, less urgent. For people accustomed to inner turbulence, this quiet can feel unsettling. Chaos can become familiar, even comforting. When it fades, there can be a strange sense of emptiness. But this emptiness is not absence. It is space. Space for reflection, space for choice, space for deliberate action. Jung believed much of neurosis came from unlived life, not reckless indulgence, but denied development. When parts of the psyche are consistently ignored, they protest, sometimes loudly, sometimes subtly. Projection, triggers, and emotional reactions are often these protests. Shadow integration restores dialogue. The psyche stops shouting when it feels heard. This is why integration moves toward life, not away from it. Toward engagement. Toward responsibility. Toward participation. You become more present in relationships, more grounded in work, more deliberate in decisions. This process also changes how you relate to others. As projection reduces, you stop taking things as personally. You are less consumed by outrage, less invested in proving moral superiority, less reactive to difference. This does not make you passive. It makes you precise. You can still recognize harmful behavior, but you no longer need to dehumanize others to feel secure. Jung believed this was an ethical achievement, not morality imposed from outside, but responsibility developed from within. When you understand your own capacity for aggression, envy, fear, and resentment, you become less likely to act them out unconsciously. You choose restraint because you understand yourself, not because you are afraid of punishment. Another sign that integration is working is a softening of identity. You become less attached to being seen a certain way, less defensive when criticized, less desperate for approval. You no longer need to protect an image, because you are not hiding from yourself. This creates a quiet confidence, not bravado, not dominance, but steadiness. You trust your ability to respond rather than react. This is why shadow work is not about becoming darker, it is about becoming whole. Wholeness includes instinct and restraint, strength and vulnerability, awareness and responsibility. A one-sided personality is fragile. A whole one is resilient. This is why Jung believed individuation was not about happiness. It was about meaning. Meaning emerges when inner conflict decreases and responsibility increases. Life becomes less reactive and more intentional. One of the greatest myths about shadow work is that it should feel dramatic. In reality, successful integration is often boring. Less chaos, fewer crises, more consistency. This can feel anticlimactic to people seeking transformation, but it is the mark of psychological health. If your interest in shadow work comes from a desire to feel special, powerful, or different, that itself is something to observe. The shadow loves identity just as much as it loves fear. Integration humbles. It does not inflate. This is why patience is essential. You do not complete shadow work. You build a relationship with your unconscious over time. Insight appears gradually, patterns soften slowly, choice expands quietly. And as this relationship matures, something paradoxical happens. You become less interested in your shadow, not because it has disappeared, but because it no longer controls you. Your attention returns to living, to creating, to relating, to choosing. The shadow will always exist, but it does not need to run your life. When it is unseen, it acts through you. When it is seen, it stands beside you, known, contained, integrated, and that is the real promise of this work. Not enlightenment, not purity, but psychological adulthood, the capacity to live consciously without denying what you are. If this helped you understand your triggers with more clarity and less self-blame, subscribe. I make grounded Jungian psychology videos that turn insight into stability. And comment below what kind of trigger shows up most for you: irritation, envy, outrage, or shame.